Thank you, Honorable Sek. Just want to establish before we proceed. I have received apologies from Minister Bridell. Unfortunately, in a cabinet meeting. I have also received apologies from Member Makamba Boicha. And those are the only apologies that I have received. Honorable Dagmo, are you able to hear us?
Chairperson, what I ask him to follow on YouTube for now, so we can proceed.
And if he has any questions, and he can just
as soon as the IT comes, then we can sort it out.
Yeah, I think Honorable Sek is correct. I mean, the notice was for in person, and we cannot take responsibility for technical difficulties that members may experience after we've extended the link for them to log in. So once again, thank you for the effort that you've made to be here in person. I know it is always a challenge sometimes to be here at a particular time with traffic in Cape Town. But the purpose of our meeting is to try to gain a deeper understanding about the concept of material irregularities and where it occurred and what is being done about it, and how we can put measures in place to mitigate the occurrence of such irregularities where it may present itself in the Western Cape. So I'm going to hand over to Ms. Adams to direct us as to how we're going to deal, our team is going to deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair, and for the welcoming introduction. So in terms of the presentation, I will be the one just taking through the presentation. And I think, as you were indicating, Chair, the key purpose is for us to come and talk more about material irregularities, what it actually means, and how has our journey been in the Western Cape. So I will share a bit around that. So before I just go into maybe delving into the detail, I know the team has been here before where they came to share the audit outcomes and unpacked it with what were some of the key findings that we've picked up over the last financial year. So my presentation will much more zoom into the area of material irregularity and basically where we are currently. Specifically also looking at from a national perspective, but also specifically then zooming into the Western Cape. In terms of our reputation promise, I always like to leave the payoff line to say that we are auditing to build public confidence. And I think as the AGSA, that why we are here in terms of the work that we do and the reports that we do give to oversight in terms of building public confidence. Now, the next slide, I think quite an important slide, and I know it looks like an extremely busy slide in terms of the information there. But as the AGSA, one of our key strategic intent is that we really want to make a difference to the lives of the ordinary citizens on the ground. And hence, one of the key things that we've identified to be able to do that was to say, for us to make a difference to the lives of citizens, there needs to be a shift in the public sector culture, critically important. And when we said how we will be able to achieve the shift in public sector culture, it's important that we need to identify all the key role players that's part of this accountability ecosystem. And what this slide is trying to demonstrate, it's demonstrating who are all the key role players as part of the accountability ecosystem. And we do believe if each of the key role players plays their role and play their part, then ultimately you will get the impact on service delivery. And I think that this was probably one of the key things for this committee also that you are driving in terms of the oversight. And I think important to note in terms of specific decision making that happens in the local government space before those decisions are made, there's various processes that it goes through, being the officials on the ground having their roles and responsibility, making sure that they perform their duties and tasks. Over those officials are senior managers that has a key role to play in terms of supervising those officials, making sure the check and balances are in place, and making sure that ultimately all those goals that they have to achieve, it's achieved. On top of that, we've got the oversight from a municipal manager, which is the accounting officer, and their roles are clearly depicted also in the MFMA, where it's very clear what are some of those roles and responsibilities. Important to note also, as part of that administration, we've got our internal audit unit that plays a very critical role. And if we go back to the MFMA in terms of Section 165, talking about the roles and responsibility of internal audit, and their main purpose is to make sure there's appropriate control environment in place, and they raise those things where there's challenges in terms of the control environment, which ultimately the audit committee having that oversight. And we do see the audit committee a very critical part if we go to Section 166, because as part of that control environment, also raising in terms of our findings that we raise as part of the action plan. So the audit committee has an important role that they play in terms of oversight of that action plan based on both findings that's been raised from an internal audit perspective and an external audit perspective. Then we get to the mayor and the speaker, and also when we go back to the legislation, clear responsibilities then are implicated there for both the mayor and speaker in terms of their role. And what we also see, the Municipal Public Accounts Committee plays a crucial role in terms of taking the Auditor General's findings or audit report, and they've got that oversight role to play to make sure what those things has been raised, what corrective action is from the administration part, are they putting in place to make sure that that information is addressed, and then ultimately council. So what is critically important, I think, in terms of this oversight process and ultimately information that flows from administration to the mayor, to council, ultimately making sure that that information is then credible. So whatever decisions making happen, it's taken place at the right level. As part of this ecosystem, there's also specific coordinating ministries, what we call them, that have a specific oversight role that they do play as part of it, and it's clearly depicted also in the legislation. In terms of their roles and responsibility that they've got to play in terms of supporting of the municipalities. And as the provincial legislature, which is your provincial parliament, they also can call the municipalities into account ultimately. But important to note, as the AGSA, we are at the center of this because we do believe, based on the work that we do, that our message, first of all, we must have the appropriate insights in taking, based on our strategic intent and what we would like to achieve, that we make sure that we have the right insights so that we can illuminate action to those on the ground. And ultimately, by having the appropriate insights, we are able to influence our stakeholders to do the appropriate action. And critical to this part, which is the enforcement part, and this is what I will share but today, which deals basically with our extended powers on the roles and responsibilities when it comes to material irregularities identified and how that process basically unfolds. And I think important active citizenry, critically important as part of this accountability ecosystem. And as AGSA also, we are working much closer together with the civil society organization for any part of risk identification where there's challenges in terms of certain service delivery aspect. I thought important, and I know the team has shared this, so I'm not going to delve into detail because they've actually spent this sufficient time. But important to note, why I actually wanted to project this slide specifically was to indicate in terms of the outcome of the Western Cape where they are currently sitting. And we would see a lot of the auditees sitting in the unqualified zone with no findings, meaning a clean audit outcome, where the financial statements are intact. There's no material errors we found. Secondly, when it comes to the area of compliance to laws and regulations, we didn't find any material findings for us to elevate to the audit report. And thirdly, when it comes to the area of performance information, no major findings. What I wanted just to do, I just wanted to pause on this because I think it's important just to also indicate from the work that we do and the process that we follow and the audit process that we follow to come to that conclusion. And it's not a case that we rely on the information that we had previously and just accept it. But there's a lot of test and balances from the audit perspective that we do to be able to come to that conclusion, to say this is an unqualified outcome with findings. So various tests and things that we do check to come to the conclusion. And I do believe as part of the process, there's so many people involved in this accountability process. So ultimately, an audit report is signed off by a senior manager, which we call the engagement manager, and they've got teams then supporting them as part of that process. For these audits, also there's an independent, what we call a quality control review that's done independently to say, based on the work that you've done for this specific auditee, can we actually, if we look at the work that you've done, can we come to the same conclusion? And so there's that independent check over and above just the senior manager or the engagement manager that in majority of these cases sign off on the audits. Also, when it comes to our risk identification process within the province itself, there is that meeting of minds together where we look from an overall perspective, what are some of the key risks that we've identified? And then we make sure if there's specific risk identified at a specific municipality, how do we replicate it throughout so that we make sure we cover similar things as part of the audit process? But I thought I just wanted to highlight, I think one of our key messages was, especially those ones in the purple zone, we are very concerned about, and mainly in the Central Karoo district area, where those municipalities are, which is Laingsburg and Beaufort West, and then Kannaland specifically. And I think that is a concern even in our messages that we've raised to say, year on year, when we look at these areas of qualification, it's very similar in nature, where the same things are qualified year on year, and similar in terms of the merits of findings when it comes to the areas of compliance to laws and regulations, where a lot of those municipalities currently, even in the yellow zone, what is hampering them to move forward is the area of compliance to laws and regulations, and hence they're sitting in that yellow zone currently. So that is that one. I think for us to be able to talk about the context of material irregularity and how we basically looked at it. So important for us to say, when we look at the whole issue of irregular expenditure, unauthorized expenditure, and fruitless and wasteful expenditure, how is it basically looking overall over the last number of years? So I think important to note, when we look at the irregular expenditure, when we go from 18-19, there has been a substantial decrease, 1 billion within the Western Cape municipalities, but the biggest chunk of that irregular expenditure relates to City of Cape Town. About 700 billion is applicable to City of Cape Town as such. And I will basically just delve into a bit of detail to say what does that information entail. So that is the first category. And a lot of times when we look at the first category of information, those are some of the things that could potentially lead to material irregularities. And I will go now a little bit to the definitions, and maybe then we'll unpack it more and maybe get the understanding to say, but we've got a big chunk of irregular expenditure. Why doesn't these translate into material irregularity? So I'll provide that context for the members. If we go to the middle block, this deals with the unauthorized expenditure. So what we normally would look here is that in terms of what was budgeted for. So normally within the municipalities, you would look in terms of the different votes that's there. So any line item that is not in line with that, it would be seen as unauthorized expenditure. Now, if you look at the nature, and we've seen a growing trend from one year to the prior year, and you look back to the nature, because for one of the key concerns when it comes to unauthorized expenditure would be what we call the cash item. So you don't have enough funding to be able to sustain your business. That would be a key concern. But when we actually analyze these unauthorized expenditure and what is sitting in there, majority of it relates to the non-cash items. And when we speak about the non-cash items, it could be in certain instances, for example, when it comes to your assets, and as the accounting policy says, you've got to depreciate your assets. So maybe how you've set up your budget to the actual now because of certain impairments occurring for the asset, it increases that item in terms of the expenditure part, but what we see it as a non-cash item. Another thing that also normally causes this is when it comes to post-retirement benefit. So in terms of post-retirement benefit, you've got to then account basically for any gains or losses, and basically account what will that future liability be that you will need to pay when people will leave the municipality. So what happened in majority of cases when it comes to that calculation, based on the assumptions that they actually use on a year-to-year basis, these assumptions can then change. So originally when you were doing the budget, you might have used the old assumption from the previous year to basically set up your budget. But now based on the actuarial calculation now that you get maybe as part of your year-end process, these numbers has changed based on risk factors and things happens in the market. Hence, then it might have an increase in the post-retirement benefits, which basically impacts your non-cash flow items that would be recorded. A third, one of the other third one, big one also when it comes to the impairment part of it, and this is where we look at the impairment for our customers, basically that owes us money. And of course, taking into account when you normally do this calculation, you take into account the circumstances, you take into account, is it commercial, customers? Is it residential customers? And then based on that, you would come up with your calculation to say, based on my history, what would be my impairment be? And as a result, as part of your budget process, now you would include it. Now it comes to the year-end processes. Now, based on maybe there's more deterioration in the economy. And as a result, you've got even more people that's not paying you. So that actually impacts then when you have to now sit back and make an assessment of your impairment that you need to then recognize in your performance statements. That also has an impact on the items. Then the last one, maybe I just wanted to touch on the unauthorized expenditure, is as you make provisions for something that timing is uncertain, and now your provision calculation is what you've originally budgeted for, and based on your actual is totally different. And hence now you have to provide more based on certain risk or circumstances. So that also increase your non-cash item. So that is one of the key reasons why we've got the unauthorized expenditure. So it's not necessary that any loss has occurred within the municipality. So it's just how you've actually calculated your expenditure from your budget. Now comparing it to your actual, those two things are out of sync. So that is on that one. The third one is the fruitless and wasteful expenditure. And this is the one normally we would spend a lot of time to make consideration for a material irregularity. Now, overall, if we look at some of this fruitless and wasteful expenditure, majority, as we indicating, relating to interest payment or penalties for late payments and specific delays contractors experience. So that we would normally go for each of those ones and go and analyze this in detail to say when we actually look at it, because when it comes to fruitless and wasteful expenditure, we ask ourselves a question: could it have been avoided before you actually had to incur this fruitless and wasteful expenditure? But I will touch a bit on it when I actually go into more the detail of the definition of a material irregularity. So that is in a nutshell. I thought important just to provide the context of what are normally the things that we would zoom into when we would make an assessment. Does this result in a material irregularity? So I think important, and hence it was important that that I explained the difference between what is irregular expenditure and what is a material irregularity. Because irregular expenditure is a non-compliance to legislation. So the non-compliance of a procurement prescript that hasn't been complied with. So I think that is fundamental when it comes to the area of irregular expenditure. When it comes to material irregularity, it's number one, first step in the system. So this that needs to be complied with. Is there any non-compliance or contravention with legislation? So that is the first one that is important. Important when we look at this, we also ask ourselves, when it comes to fraud and theft and breach of fiduciary duties, we also ask ourselves the question: is there any fraud-related transaction that we need to be aware of or alert of that during this process? breach of fiduciary duties, and this would be more in terms of when it comes to specific companies, like, for example, our CTICC that we also audit. There's certain compliance that they've got to comply with in terms of the Companies Act. Their directors have roles and responsibility. So we basically would zoom into there to see, is there any of those that fits that category? So the first part is the non-compliance. The second part is the identify during the audit, very critically important. Under the Public Audit Act, that is likely to result likely to result in a material financial loss. So key, I think the difference now between irregular expenditure, it's the non-compliance that results in the irregular expenditure, where in this instance, it's a non-compliance, but the key trigger for a material irregularity is the financial loss part of it. So if there has been a non-compliance, so that's a tick in the box if we go back to the definition of irregular expenditure. But if we can determine there was value for money or the goods and services has been delivered, that is not then, the financial loss criteria is not then fulfilled. The other one that we also started to look further in is to say the misuse or the loss of material public resource or substantial harm to a public sector institution or the general public. And so we've started, I think, in terms of the process when it comes to our MI identification, specifically when it comes to substantial harm, that over the number of years, not specifically in the Western Cape, where we've actually issued material irregularities in instances where our auditors, for example, had a disclaimer in the prior year and in the current year. Because when we disclaim an audit opinion, we're actually saying we cannot give an opinion on this set of financial statements. And mainly because there's not documentation in place. Now, in the prior year, we had Beaufort, I think, in that position. So if in the current year they would have had the same opinion, we would have issued a substantial harm, a material irregularity for the year under review. This year also, this year when in our MFMA cycle, when we also looked at certain service delivery work that we've done, for example, on wastewater treatment plant. And one of the discoveries that we've made that in certain cases, these things are not properly maintained. So the spillage then that goes from the wastewater treatment plant into basically the reservoirs where public gets water from those reservoirs, or even sometimes the rivers. So in those cases, we've raised some material irregularities in other provinces, the part to the substantial harm to the general public. As such, because of course people drink of that water. If that water is contaminated, people can get sick and ultimately could then land up in hospital. One of the things that we've also done this year differently, in the past number of years, we've struggled a bit where our auditors don't submit their financial statements on time. In Western Cape, we had a couple of those, but they managed then to submit within a month or two. But what we then started to do last year, we started to issue material irregularities where we did not get submission financial statements on time. And the main reason for that, or the reason behind it, was firstly, if that financial statements are not submitted on time, the oversight process cannot happen, because financial statements are supposed to be submitted by the 31st of August, needs to be audited by the 30th of November, and there's certain oversight process that needs to happen from a council perspective to the public, ultimately producing your oversight report of your annual report by the 31st of March. So if that doesn't happen, it delays the process. For accountability for the administration. Secondly, what's important, if you don't submit financial statements on time, National Treasury withholds money. So ultimately, what does that impact? So if National Treasury withholds the money because you didn't submit financial statements, what does it impact? Service delivery of the citizens on the ground, because now you don't get the full portion of your equitable share as you are supposed to. So that's definitely for this year something that we're definitely going to pursue for our auditors that is not going to submit the financial statements on time. So important, I think, to note in terms of this process of material irregularities, number one, was there non-compliance? First one. Secondly, was it identified during the audit? Does it result in a financial loss? So I think that is the critical part. Now, important to note in terms of the powers that we have, and I'll speak a bit later about when we look at from a national perspective also, where we are currently with the process with issuing some of this material irregularities to date. So in some of the cases, as AGSA, we've got the option to refer a material irregularity that we've identified for further investigation to a public body. So there's a couple that we've actually looked at, and we have actually referred it to a public body for further investigation. So there's a number of those. Either in instances, for example, where the accounting officer he or her is himself involved, it wouldn't make sense for you to refer material irregularity to them to investigate themselves. So in those instances, we would refer it. Or in instances, for example, where we find that this requires a different type of expertise in terms from a fraud perspective, where further work needs to be done. So in those cases, we would refer to the WARC, to SIU, in some instances also then to the public protector. And we've also referred a few to National Treasury, where in terms of the legislation, they needed then to give an outcome for us in terms of the view of certain matters. And the next part is basically, so when we basically issue this material irregularity, when we've actually picked up on the material irregularity, we normally allow our auditors to respond. And I think the first step for us, what would be critically important at the time when we communicate, so before we actually issue the material irregularity, we normally go through a process where we communicate a communication of audit finding. We've identified a finding. The auditee then have an opportunity to respond to us. We actually would prefer at that first point of call when we actually issue this finding for them to do something about it. And we've seen auditees, for example, where we issued the finding, they immediately course correct, or when there was a loss, they recovered the money from the supplier, and then we didn't go through the process of issuing the material irregularity, because actually ultimately what we wanted to see, first of all, the recovery of the loss, and secondly, consequence management to take place against the officials. But in those instances where we don't then get the immediate correction, we then would issue the material irregularity, allowing the auditors to respond within 20 days, where they've indicated what process they will follow. As auditors, then we go to a process to evaluate this information to say, okay, if they indicate this is the steps that we're going to take to recover the loss, we will investigate it, we will make sure we recover it, and they would have specific timelines. We will then make that assessment to say, okay, as part of the process, we will allow your accounting officer to do your role in responsibility. So if they need 3 months to do that, so we allow them the time to do that. But now the process unfolds further. If we now come back based on that commitment that they've given to us, and we see that actually, since we've left here to now, there's actually no progress on these material irregularities that we've identified, we can now go the next step in the process where we actually can give recommendations included in the audit report, and where we will indicate this is the steps that you will follow within a specific period of time. So that's actually the next step that we go to. If we now find ourselves in a position that we've given the recommendations, but after a period of time, and I will name some examples, I think where we are at that stage now of taking binding remedial action, we still see the accounting officer is not responding appropriately as they're supposed to, we will then go to the next step, issuing binding remedial action. So immediately if that step is triggered, the binding remedial action, it triggers then the process for us to be able then to go to the next step, which is the issue of a certificate of debt, which is then the final part of this process. But I think important to note, if we really get to a certificate of debt, then what we are actually also saying, when it comes to all the oversight process that's in place, those processes also failed. And as I was demonstrating when I was speaking about the accountability ecosystem and all of those part of the ecosystem, and I think important to note for this committee, specifically having oversight over the local government sphere, in instances where we've actually issued these material irregularities, we would report it in the audit report. And important in terms of where we would request the assistance of the committee to make sure whatever commitment they've made to us for implementation, that those things are also follow up vigorously. Because if based on the chances that we do give, because it's not just a once-off chance, because as part of the process, we need to make sure there's fairness in the process. But ultimately, if we really get to a certificate of debt, then ultimately the oversight process has also failed for us to get to that process. And every intervention that's available in terms of the legislation did not work. But I'll explain when I cite some examples of where we are with some of those. But I thought it was just important for me just to talk about the definition of a material irregularity. What is the difference between irregular expenditure and a material irregularity, and also the unauthorized and fruitless and wasteful expenditure. So this is basically some of the material irregularities that we've identified from a national perspective. Now, I think important to note, when we started out with this legislation, we started to look at a phase-in approach. And when we were looking at a phase-in approach, the focus was more concentrated on, when we look at the myriad of irregular expenditure across local government, where is the ones with the biggest? So we were very intentional to say, those ones actually we want to scope in first, because there's issues there of accountability that needs to be addressed. And hence, every year we faced in more audits as we went along, in terms of identifying material irregularities. So you would notice to date we've got 94 that is facing across the country for the material irregularity. I think important to note, when we looking at some of the action in terms of, based on the material irregularities that we've identified, in 145 cases, as you see there was a 3.9 billion losses across board that we've identified. Now, in the next slide, it speaks about all of those that we've identified, at what stages they are as part of this material irregular process. I've also spoken about the substantial harm. We have spoken about those municipalities with the disclaimers of opinion, where we've issued across the board for those ones to say, please get your record management in place, making sure there's consequence management, because ultimately why there would be disclaimer, because there's no records in place. And then we've also started issuing material irregularities on substantial harm to the general public. And I've made that example of the wastewater treatment plant for the last year that we've basically taken. So I think important for us to note, in terms of when we issue these material irregularity, it's important, number one, it needs to be investigated. Secondly, where there's a financial loss, that loss needs to be recovered. And also importantly to note that if those things occur, there should be consequence management. And I think this is where the big challenge comes in terms of the consequence management part. And I think in the fourth part, critically important, the control environment needs to be improved so that these things are not repeated. Yes, it was identified, it was discovered, but how are you then improving your control environment so that we don't find the same findings? The next slide basically deals with, in terms of when you look at that 185 in total that we've identified, where is the process currently and what are the next steps basically it holds. No? So if you look at this in terms of, there's about 6 MIs resolved basically where we were satisfied as the AGSA appropriate action has been taken across the board. Then the bulk of the MIs is sitting basically where the accounting office is still taking action. And as the auditors, when we go there, we're actually following up on this action that they are taking. And every time when we engage, we do follow up. In certain instances, you see that 26% we're indicating this was instances where the accounting officer had an opportunity to take action. They didn't take the appropriate action, and hence now we go over to the next stage of the process. So you would notice that for a couple of municipalities there across the board, we've actually issued recommendations in the audit report where it will be clearly stipulated the steps that they need to follow to rectify this. And they would be normally given a period of 4 to 6 months to course correct. So if they don't course correct, then we can go over to the next step. So a couple of, I think a number of municipalities there across the country, I'm not going to mention their names, that we've actually issued in this last cycle some recommendation. Then we've got one basically where we're actually now in the process of remedial action. So if those are not implemented appropriately, we can now move to the stage of certificate of debt and recover that money from the accounting officer if that remedial action is not implemented. Then we basically, as I've mentioned, we've referred some to a public body for further investigation, and that was specifically to the Hawks for that specific Machabeng municipality that we've referred one. Okay, but let's come now to the Western Cape as such in terms of the material irregularities that we've identified within the province. And I think important to note from the context when I was speaking about the irregular expenditure and the quantum of irregular expenditure and what makes up the irregular expenditure. So as indicated, we were sitting with about 1.2 billion of irregular expenditure. Of that, about 700 and something, say 750 million related to the city of Cape Town. Now, if we go back and we analyze this irregular expenditure maybe a bit in more detail, a lot of that related, for example, to extension of contracts that happened. So a contract came to an end, but because the services was needed on the ground, the contract was continued without having taken the appropriate process to extend the contract or to basically go through a process then to go out on a tender. So that also came from the prior year of some of the things that we've identified that then continue the regular expenditure for the current year. In certain instances, I think we also found that where a supplier's tax matters wasn't in order, but the contract was awarded. So it doesn't mean that there was a loss because they were able to still to deliver the services on the ground when it comes to the irregular expenditure that was identified. Furthermore, if we go deeper for other municipalities also which had quite huge balances when it comes to irregular expenditure, a lot of that relates to the bid adjudication committees. So what happened about 2 years ago, we identified a finding across board that how the bid adjudication committees was constituted. So in terms of the legislation, section 29, it's very clear that the makeup of a bid adjudication committee. So in instances that when we actually were looking at it, then not in all cases the senior officials was present there, or in cases, for example, where said it must be the head, the CFO must be there in the head of supply chain, then in those instances we found it wasn't always compliant. So also then a big chunk of the irregular expenditure at our other municipalities related to the bid adjudication committees, no? In terms of how it was constituted. But they did put processes in place based on also clarity provided by NT in that process. So yes, we found that from the previous year, some of these things also spilled over to the current year, but in most of the cases, these things has been addressed. So we would call that in some instances irregular expenditure of a technical nature. So they still advertised the bid, they went through the process, but how they constituted their bid adjudication committee, those were the challenges. Some of the other findings that we also find, which is where the officials deviate from the supply chain process, and when that deviation basically happens, it's either not done by the appropriate delegated official. So in terms of the delegation of authority, before if I'm reporting to the municipal manager, maybe my threshold is 200,000, so I can't approve maybe above 200,000, and the next person has a higher threshold. So we found in those cases that when those deviations was approved, it wasn't at the right delegated level. That's resulted in some of the irregular expenditure. The other one also relating to extension of contracts, where contracts then was extended, and when we actually evaluated, we indicate that no, but because you didn't do appropriate planning as part of your process, this contract actually didn't need to be extended. If you knew, for example, for the refuge removal, that contract has a 5-year period. So already from the 3rd year, you needed to start planning. So we know refuge removal is an important service that needs to go to the citizens. But if you just plan properly and you knew in year 3, this contract is coming up in 2 years' time, I must advertise, you could have prevented that. And there's a lot of those type of things that then results in the irregular expenditure that we've identified for the year. So I think important when we look at the irregular expenditure, so yes, there's a non-compliance there, but the element of the financial loss part to say, can we actually confirm on the ground that was the goods delivered? Secondly, was the service delivered? So that would be part of our audit procedures and audit process that we would like to confirm. The other big one that I've actually noticed by one of the municipalities that they've disclosed, and this was also something that we've raised previously, if they piggyback on contracts in terms of Regulation 32. So one municipality maybe went to procure a service, say for accounting service. Now another municipality is piggybacking on the same contract. But in terms of that regulation, there's certain terms of conditions that must be compliant with before they can actually piggyback, and all the requirements needs to fulfill. So it's in those instances that we've also then identified some of the irregular expenditure. So I thought it was important maybe for me just to give context. So when we look at this 1.2 billion, what is in there and what does it consist, and why don't we see more material irregularities transpiring in the Western Cape? But as indicated that we have identified some material irregularities in the Western Cape for City of Cape Town. So we've identified in the previous year basically 3 of these material irregularities, and mainly one of the key things that we looked at there, and it basically related to the demand management for the service. So if you go to City of Cape Town's audit report, also those material irregularities that we've identified is published in their specific report. So one of the key things that we've actually discovered that in terms of the supplier, they would normally be on call. For example, if somebody's pipe bursts or somebody has a leakage, you would phone the central number at City of Cape Town. They would go on a call and go out to then assist in terms of that emergency. But when we were looking at the information, we established, first of all, there's no proper needs assessment that was done. So remember, when somebody's normally on standby, similar with what you find with in terms of other services, like when doctors or artisans on standby, there's based on your history, there's a percentage of people that's normally on standby. Everybody's normally not on standby. But in this case, everybody was on standby and people were actually paid for in services where it was actually not needed. But because you're on standby, you must get the standby allowance. So the first one that we've raised, we said, if City of Cape Town has done a proper need analysis, there wouldn't have been this extra money that it would have been paid, because it could be, or if you have 100% component, maybe only 20% needs to be on standby. So we went then back to the history of that. That was the part. The second part, I think, when we were just looking at the invoices and how the billing was done for this one, we've actually saw there was in certain instances some overcharging that happened. So that was what we've identified in terms of the likely loss at that point in time. So currently where that process is currently, and I think for the next audit cycle, it would be critically important if City hasn't taken the appropriate action, we will have to go over to the next step to do the recommendations. In the last audit cycle, we have indicated that they are taking appropriate action, because at that point in time, they were still concluding on the investigation to be able to how they will be recovering the loss. So they've appointed an independent firm to do that on their behalf. And then secondly, making sure that the consequence management occur. So it would be critical in this cycle here that will be embarking on that we are busy now, that appropriate action must then be taken. So if not, then it can go then to the next step. The other one that we've raised relating to Beaufort West Municipality, and that was basically when we were looking at the billing information, we basically discovered not in all cases was revenue billed that's supposed to be billed to certain customers within the area. And mainly because of the completeness of information that they didn't completely bill. And I think we went then back to the valuation role to look at that information and compare it, the valuation role to the billing system, and then found some of those anomalies. So this one is one that we've issued this year for them. So in terms of the process, it will definitely be one that we will be following up in the cycle. And so the estimated loss that we've worked out there was about 18 million in total for the loss. If those things are then corrected and the proper consequence management happens. So I think as an office and specifically in the Western Cape itself, we are then on a continuous basis looking at the risk assessment process. How do we then go about identifying these things when those losses? So one of the key things, as I've indicated, that things that the teams are exploring further specifically when it comes to the fruitless and wasteful part, to say, based on this, when we're saying there's a loss, what was the processes that then in place? So those are other things that we are exploring further for the material irregularity process. But I thought important that we just provide context to say, yes, we see a big quantum of irregular expenditure. What does it entail? Because it's important that you break it down and then to say, did any of that result in a loss? And then we would normally then follow the steps and then follow the process. But Chair, that is basically from my side in the presentation. In terms of just providing context on the process.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. It's quite a mouthful. We have somebody in the room who has not sort of introduced herself. I could ask the lady to introduce herself.
Oh, there you go. Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Kalfima Abrams. I'm the Senior Manager for Provincial Parliament.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. Abrams, okay, sorry. I just want to establish whether Honorable Dagmo is, online and whether he can hear me. Thank you, Honorable Dagmo. We can hear you, albeit very faintly, but we will see if we can amplify your voice. Okay, for sure. Thank you. My colleagues, I'm going to open the floor for questions, and I'm sure at this stage are many. Some Honorable Dagmo, I'm going to start with the members in the House first, and then I will revert back to you if you have any questions. So in this order, I'm going to ask Honorable Maslodi Maseko, who's going to pose the first question. I'm going to take 2 rounds, or so two questions for the first round, and then we will have further rounds after. And Honorable Marie, and then Honorable Dagmo. Okay, please proceed.
Okay, thank you very much. I think being we a bit disadvantaged because we are on scope, so sometimes we feel like I think I asked that question, so why am I going to ask again? But thank you for the presentation, and I agree with the chairperson is being mouthful. But I mean, we engaged with APEC recently, and in a way we sort of identified some of the shortcomings from the oversight, also part of it, the AG, the oversight of how do we go about. So bear with me, Chair, if I'm going to try to find the foundation or the basis of how do we go about in mitigating some of the risks that have been identified. So in the slide 3 of the AG, we do have on the side of the municipality, the internal audit unit and the audit committee. So that's where the component where we think that also identification of the risk and also mitigating those risks have to start there before it even goes to the Auditor General to identify that they are sort of there to look at whatever that has been identified sometimes before that. They must make sure that that doesn't happen again. Now, after that, you see the arrow that goes direct to the municipal manager. Now, the question from me, it will be, now, where does the CFO comes in the municipalities, especially when the AG indicated to us that one of the concerning issues were the issue of using the consultants. So it becomes like a double pay for the consultant as they get hired and the CFO whilst is there. And now the issue of when you the municipal manager becomes the one that is responsible in interacting with the internal audit committee or the internal audit unit or the audit committee, and the CFO is not done, is there not where maybe there is a loophole that sometimes it can be if you are going to get a municipal manager that doesn't have a good relationship with the CFO, there will be information not shared between the two. And I'm talking to the worst case scenario, if that might be the case. I'm not talking directly to anything that is like that. And also from the municipalities, how is the municipality public accounts committee, the MPAC, working with, from the province side, we've got a good relationship that we can always engage with the audit committee to come and talk to us. But the MPAC part of it, how is it empowered? Do you have sometimes that engagement or extending a hand to communicate with them to sort of empower them to know in doing an oversight, to what an extent can they go within their municipalities? And I'm asking this because most of the time we sort of identified that our municipalities in the MPAC, there is a perception that they have to get the information to them. They don't have to go and try to do the oversight. But that comes with the knowledge of being given the skills of, by the way, you can do the oversight by doing 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's not going to come easily unless if the Auditor General also can extend the hand of empowering that MPAC with a new concept within the municipalities. And after 5 years, there is a new MPAC members that comes in without having that knowledge of, by the way, how can I go about? So if I can start with that, Chair, it will be just to give the foundation of the questions that I want to ask, to what an extent do we have the oversight part of it within the municipalities to try to tighten before the AG can come? Because, and we have seen in the human settlements when we went to Bito, then the councillors will say, oh, the officials, they don't want to give us information. Now, the Auditor General comes with their predetermined objectives when they do the auditing. It's not the reality of what's happened, because we went to that municipality, a project of 3 million ended up with the 10 million, and still they got a clean audit. So it's something that we have to say, the oversight has to be the one that plays in role. And maybe the last one that I have to throw in that is not here, the issue of where we say the AG has to go and look in something like that, it has to be paid. So when coming to the municipality, they also have to pay a certain extra amount for a specific case to be looked at from the AG, or it's different? You can go in the municipalities to assess to that, Chair. That's all from me.
Thank you, Honourable Ms. Seku. Honourable Murray.
Thank you, Chair. So for this round, my first question is also with reference to slide 3. How are you practically enhancing active citizenry? You mentioned workshops that were taking place, but I'm interested to know how this is taking place within rural communities and with townships, because obviously this is very technical information. So I'm interested to know on how it is translated practically. And I'm also interested in how it's done in communities that are underperforming, such as municipalities within the Central Karoo. I wonder if having better active citizenry there would help to create better accountability in the long run. My second question is, you mentioned impairment as an issue that could affect, going back to slide 2. No, sorry. Slide 5. Impairment as an issue that could result in unauthorized expenditure. On that, I wanted to understand, is this more something that you see in underperforming communities or underperforming municipalities or oddities, or something that you see more in our better performing ones? Where is this most likely to rear its head? Those are my 2 questions for this round. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Murray. Honourable Jagmo, you have any questions you'd like to pose now?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
We can, and perhaps if the members of the AG's office can't hear you, we will try to communicate same to them.
Are they not there in the meeting with you?
They're in the meeting, but I don't know if they're able to hear you because you're very faint. But to ask a question, we will try to communicate that.
No, thank you. Just to say, Chair, Chair, you would recall that when the Auditor General first came and briefed us, there was a very specific question which was asked, and that was whether, since the strengthened legislation was signed into law by the President on the 1st of April 2019, whether the Auditor General in the Western Cape has referred a single material irregularity to an outside body, i.e. the Hawks, the Public Protector. And in that response of the Auditor General said no, there had not been one referral for investigation to an outside body in the Western Cape. And then I would be surprised, and I'm not sure whether the Auditor General can explain this, but I raised my concern at a public level, and then there was a statement by the Auditor General's office which basically said that what I was saying was not true, whereas I've gone through the record of the first meeting we held where the Auditor General made it clear that not a single material irregularity had been referred to an outside authority. Now I understand the process which is outlined about going to the MMO. If I can just specifically refer to the slide that I'm referring to in the presentation. If you look at this slide, Chair, it is slide number, the slide which says material number 6. So the very first one, it says if the accounting office does not appropriately deal with our expanded mandate allows us to refer the material irregularity to a relevant public body. So the first thing I want to clarify is the Auditor General's position still, as we were told in the first meeting, that in regard to the actual referral in the Western Cape of any municipality or municipal official to a relevant public, that the answer remains the same. No. In other words, doesn't mean that there weren't material irregularities that were being followed up. My question was very specific. And then what surprised me and disappointed me was that there was a formal statement by the Auditor General's media person which disputed what I was saying. And I think that simply brings the Office of the Auditor General into disrepute when a statement like that is issued, because the evidence that we got in that first meeting was that no would like to ask, number one, is that the case that in the Western Cape, there has not been, after whatever process, an actual referral to the Hawks, the public protector? That's the first thing. And secondly, could the Auditor General please explain why then the Auditor General's office issued the misleading public statement? Did they get that information from the people that presented to us? Or where did they get that information? Because I take that in a very serious light. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Dagmo. Just to sort of recap, the one question is whether the AG's office in the Western Cape referred any single material irregularity to an outside body since its inception of the enhanced powers of the AG's office. And secondly, a misleading statement ostensibly originated from the AG's office in the sense that I'm not so sure, Jan, what's that misleading? Honorable Dagmo, can you just refresh quickly the misleading statement?
Thank you, Chair. No, maybe I must also just send a WhatsApp to the group and then you can raise it. I want to apologize for not being there. I haven't been well this morning. That's why I'm not there. But basically, after that committee meeting, I issued a statement as an MPL leader of the opposition, raising my concern as to the fact that in the response we were given, in evidence which is recorded, the AG told us that since 1st of April 2019,
yeah.
So I issued a statement, and then there was a statement for the Auditor General's office which disputed that, which went directly against what the evidence we had taken. So I want to know, who did that person consult, before they issued that statement? Because we all got the evidence. The Auditor General said to us that the Auditor General in the Western Cape had not referred a single matter to an outside body. That doesn't mean that the Auditor General hadn't followed a process on material irregularities. So
Sure.
why did they actually issue a statement which was misleading?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Honourable Dagmo. I don't think I'm going to just deal with that. I'm going to just pass it on to the AG's office. But wherever I think it is appropriate, I'm just going to just a little add to the questions that may relate to a particular matter. And that being with the functioning of internal audit committees and internal audit controls that the Honourable Maseko raised. In many of these small municipalities, they do not have internal control sort of capabilities, and in some instances that they don't even have functioning internal control committees. How can we, as the provincial legislature, as an oversight body, sort of assist in addressing that, or the department for that instance, because they don't have the money, they don't have the skills sometimes. Would it possibly be perhaps a shared services sort of function within a district, perhaps, that you have these internal control committees that on a district level will then sort of exercise that function for all the municipalities within a district. And then there are some municipalities that can possibly just afford to have that sort of function. Ms. Adams, I'm going to hand over to you to respond to the question raised by members. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chair, Honourable Chair and members for the question. So maybe if I deal with the first one that speaks to that slide of the accountability ecosystem and the key role. So I think maybe one of the things that I didn't emphasize when we was talking about senior managers, we were referring to the Section 57 employees. And the CFO is one of those section 57. Maybe I should have, because they've got such a critical role to play as taking accountability for that set of financial statements. So definitely in terms of that that diagram as a section 57, definitely the CFO plays an important role, and they cannot be missed as that is in terms of that role. And I think important to note, and you've raised the issue of consultants, no? Because just generally across the board, you find sometimes challenges when it comes to the appointment process of consultants. So what we've actually started to do this, and not in the Western Cape as such yet, we've actually issued material irregularities of recent in that area where, if you go back to the cost containment measure, when you have to appoint consultants, there's certain processes that you have to follow in terms of need assessment. And that we found that in certain cases, those processes wasn't followed. So in some cases, for example, there is competent officials that's been appointed to do the job, plus over and above, you go through a process of appointing consultants, but you also, they're not clear on what they must deliver on. And the expectation. So hence we've started just to look at it to basically indicate there is a proper process to follow. There's nothing wrong with appointing consultants, but the appropriate process needs to be followed in those instances. So definitely they've got a key role to play with the link back to the internal audit and audit committee, because ultimately a lot of the reports that goes to the audit committee comes from the CFO's office as such. For consideration. Then the next one, which is a quite good question on the impact and the empowerment part that they've got to, that they play. So I think generally from our perspective, so we normally have, and I know of recent Sangeeta did have those engagement with the chairs of the impact, where we normally then play a role in there in terms of empowering them, and our teams then also on the ground when after the tabling of the report happens, we actually spend that time on a senior management level to speak about their roles and responsibility, also in terms of what is in our audit report and basically clarifying it for them. I do believe that the internal audit has an important role to play, because for impact to be functioning appropriately, they need people on the ground to assist them, to advise them. And so also we are in collaboration with Salgo, that we also basically have various of training for the new councillors that came into being and for the impact members in terms of the oversight role. In some instances, you find that these impacts are strong, they stand the ground, but some of them do struggle. So we need to see in terms of capacitation and support what other leverage we can pull. I do believe as this provincial parliament legislature, because there's a lot of checks and balances in place, and it's definitely a place where they can come and learn from in terms of how the oversight process is unfold and the process, the structure it follows, no? In that regard. So I definitely think there would be great lessons that they will be able to learn from sharing information, maybe a type of master class with them, because you guys, I mean, as honorable members of these various committee, you've got experiences and you know, for example, what are the things to zoom into for you to be able to get the appropriate response from the department. Because sometimes I think that they are find in a difficult position because they're dependent on the officials to give them information. But how in terms of your oversight role do you basically say, yes, in terms of what you're saying, but how do I make sure you are going to do what you're supposed to do so that we don't find ourselves in the position? How do I then appropriately and also make sure that appropriate action is taken in terms of the resolutions that we give? And maybe that is another place that maybe assistance is needed, where when those resolutions are taken to say you need to do A, B, and C, are those things vigorously follow up? Because of course, if those things are not vigorously follow up, then the impact. And I think importantly, because the municipalities are in the face of service delivery, I think this is even a more critical role that they've got to play in terms of making sure that credibility of the information then is put on the table for decision making. The next one, and I think that was more about us looking at specific things. Now, when you're talking about this project, somebody was appointed maybe to construct a road, you find the original budget was, for example, 3 million, like as you were indicating. And it's something that we are looking at and definitely reporting, because we do look at specific projects based on our risk identification, but nothing stops us when as members you've identified something that you want us to look at as while we are busy with the audit process. It's always easy while we are busy, then we can look into and zoom into specific things, because this helps us in our risk identification process. So what we do find that a lot of times these projects are delayed. And when any project is delayed with a month or two, the cost implication, it triples, it doubles as a result of that, because things becomes more expensive. So when we normally look at this information and how we're starting to link it. So interesting, when we were doing the work on predetermined objectives now the last round. So our performance auditors team on the ground, for example, were looking at specific projects. No? But remember now, any project, it should, if you follow the accountability process of the municipality. So we start with the IDP process, where all the needs is identified from the community. We go from there, we say, okay, based on these needs that the community has, and based on what the community has said to us is important, these are the things that we can focus on. Then the next process, they look at the budget process. And then from there, they develop the the service delivery budget implementation plan, where they say, based on the projects that we will be delivering, these are the budgets that's allocated, and this is how it links to the service delivery that comes here from my strategic goals that I've set for myself. What we actually discovered that in certain cases, some major projects is not even on the IDP, on the SDBIP. So meaning you're spending money on something that maybe you haven't prioritized from the start to say, this is something important that I need to do. And I think why the link is important for us, because any project on the ground is not just a project. It's a promise that you've made to the community. And then if you don't deliver on that project within that specific time, based on that specific need, maybe providing access to pipe water or providing access to toilet. So if that need of that community is not met, you're able not then to provide the service delivery that you've originally promised to the community that will be coming at a specific time. And that's why I think this point that you raised on the projects on the ground and how long it takes to complete, and the spending involved, because ultimately, if you have done what you're supposed to do from the start, you've done your needs analysis appropriately, your business is planned, done appropriately, your costing should have been done appropriately. And when we were just looking at the service delivery wheel overall to say, what will give us the impact of service delivery? So we said it starts with the indicator, that quality. When you actually develop your targeting indicator, is it a quality target indicator? Does it link to your mandate? The second part of the process is the budget process. To say, yes, now you've got these things that you've got to deliver, but do you have the appropriate financial resources to be able to deliver on it? Then the third step we said important from an oversight perspective. So as we know that for approval of these things, it goes to council. The Department of Local Government, Provincial Treasury, they've got oversights, DPM in some instances. But when this information comes to the table, what do they actually do with the information? Do they give the appropriate feedback then that they've identified some of these findings? Then the fourth phase we said is the implementation part of it. So making sure you've set yourself certain projects and how is your implementation process to monitor these projects. And then ultimately is the course correct. So there's specific things throughout your year that you maybe didn't deliver on, but what processes do you have in place to course correct those things that's not going according to plan? Because immediately if you do that evaluation and you look at the information, where did I miss? But the key thing is that when that information goes to the oversight, which is the third level, but it's not credible, you find that incorrect decisions are made. So now for first, second and third quarter, as the council, those 71 and 72 reports that they get, but they see everything is on track. So now there's no alarm bells that's being raised. But now you come, your fourth quarter, you see, but whatever was there is actually not appropriate. And as a result of that, then ultimately it impacts the service delivery to the citizens on the ground. So this project thing is something definitely that we zooming into to say, really this non-delivery, it has an impact on the citizen on the ground. So if there's any, I think, things that the committee is concerned about, raise it with us. We are on the ground now during the cycle. So we will definitely look at some of those. The next question that I want to go in terms of the active citizenry that I've mentioned, and I think critically important. So as the Auditor General, what we've started now with the process where we engage much more with the CS, civil society organization. And in some cases, we use some of their work for our risk assessment. But I think importantly, and I think why we also raising the issue, and when we were also engaging with the Premier, when we gave him some feedback on some of the service delivery challenges, we said this would be important key role plays to get closer, because they are a lot of times there on the ground. And I think importantly enough, if we go back to the MFMA and the MSA, and it speaks about public participation, and it speaks about from a municipality perspective, in terms of public participation, the role of the councillors, very important. The ward councillors on the ground looking at those ward plans. That is a basis in terms of what are the needs of the communities on the ground. But I do believe to strengthen this, and you're 100% right, when things are not going according to plan, and we've seen if civil society speaks, the citizens on the ground speaks, you get the impact then on things in some way changing. But if they don't, if they're not active, they just accept the status quo. In some cases, maybe they've given up and think we are tired of speaking. But important, I think, for the future, that is going to be critically important, the civil society and speaking up, because then you will be able then to say what are the needs on the ground and able then to address this from there. When it comes to the issue of the impairment part, so if we look at it, it is across board, but yes, the towns that is struggling, that is where the biggest challenge are. So we've marked in the Central Karoo district some of those. If you take the economic activity there, that is where major challenges are, and then also some other municipalities that we've identified in certain of the town. So yes, where there is poorer communities, of course, this increases. But I think, however, we do find also that in terms of the equitable share, those grants are available for the indigents to come and apply for it. And when we actually audit a lot of times, because the municipality would have this in their indicator as part of their predetermined objective. And then a lot of times when we want to confirm the information on the ground, to say, is there process in place, your application process, does the people that qualify gets this specific grant as they're supposed to, then there's where their processes are not in place that we find a lot of times challenges. So you're 100% right. You do get maybe in those communities that can't afford it, that it might increase in that regard. So the next question may be of Honourable Dagmore relating to, Chair, the item referred. So I will just maybe speak of my recollection of the event. I was not, but I think where we were concerned when we were specifically looking at this media article, it was more coming from the point of view that in the Western Cape we have not identified material irregularities, and I think that is where we were coming from, to say no, but actually we have issued a couple of material irregularities, and we've displayed it from that perspective, that we've issued some material irregularities. When it comes to the issue of the referral part, and I think as I was just demonstrating in terms of the slide that was up there, that it's not necessary that we would refer something to a public body. We would basically, if we've identified, so the first step before we can refer, we must identify the material irregularity. Now, in terms of the Western Cape, as we've indicated, there was about, I think, 3 of them that we've identified, or 4, sorry, that we've identified during the year. in those instances, in the 3 that we've identified for the city of Cape Town, at this point in time, we do believe that the accounting officer is taking appropriate action in terms of investigating the matter. So for this audit process, it would be important for us looking at that reports that came from the forensic investigation, what it is telling us, and then can the money be recovered? Is there consequence made? If we believe that when we assess this information, there's huge fraud risk indicators, we might make a decision to refer, but only a decision to refer it if we believe that in terms of the roles and responsibility of the accounting officer, they cannot perform their duty. If I look at another one of the revenue build, and that one we're not referring currently where, because it's something that we've only issued for the current year, where the municipality now is basically has responded to us in making sure they take corrective steps. If we go in there and we find but they're not doing what they're supposed to do, we feel there is some fraud or corruption in it, then we might consider to refer it. So in the other instances, not necessary with material irregularities as such, but there is a close working relationship that our office do have with the Hawks and with the other public bodies. So if there's any risk that we've identified, we normally have this regular quarterly interventions similar with the public protector, where we share information from a risk assessment with them of things that we want to alert them from. But in terms of referral for the Western Cape, there was no need to refer anything at this point in time for further investigation to the public body. So maybe just from that perspective. Then on the internal control capability, so I totally agree with the sentiments, Honourable Chair. There is certain challenges that we do see on the ground when it comes to this internal control environment. And we've highlighted those municipalities that we were concerned about, specifically those in the purple zone that has qualifications, and also the ones in the yellow zone. And I know at a specific point in time, they were looking at the shared services for the Central Karoo District for internal audit. And I think that is something good that can definitely work, because there is a skill shortage. So if you have them servicing the entire districts, it makes sure that that skill is then used in the entire districts. And I think similar from a province side, they've got that shared services, which we do see it works effectively. So I definitely think if that is a route they can pursue, it will definitely impact them in terms of the functioning of the control environment. I hope I've responded appropriately. Thanks, Chair.
I shall not be the judge of that, Ms. Adams. But what I can say, I just want to add, I think that something that in terms of the questions relating to the active citizenry, I think board committees also plays a very important role in that sort of control environment, because often board committees are treated as a tick box exercise, and we just need to have one to comply with the Structures Act. But certainly, and board committees itself need to be empowered more to play that active citizenry role. So colleagues, those were the responses. If you have follow-ups and new questions, I'll get to you, Honourable Dagmo, and then we will give you an opportunity to do so. And I'm going to take the same order as the questions were initially asked in round 1, and hence I recognize Honourable Maseko.
Thank you very much, Chair. Chair, I just want to find out, in there, you talked about the issue of that, and work with me so that I understand. So you identify, let's say you are going to refer a finding to the accounting officer, so in consequence management. So you identify and you refer. And after you refer maybe to a municipality to investigate, you are the accounting officer. Now, when the municipality gets an independent body to investigate, what do they have to investigate that you haven't identified? I'm trying to check moving towards the period of implementation of the consequence management, because of now does it have the period of you allow a municipality to investigate within a period of time, or you wait for the municipality to say, okay, this is what we found out and then this is action that is going to be implemented, or it's you who give the framework, the template of this is what are the expectation by the period, by this period, this has to happen, and just on the consequence management from there, if you can repeat to us. I know you talked about it, but now in the municipalities, I'm trying to find out, especially identifying that there's a capacity sometimes that is a little bit challenged, because it can be, it goes to even the main man of the municipality, the MM. How do you make sure that at the end there's going to be that difference, that it will add value for consequence management? Because it can't be the solution. It's just a deterrent for the future outcome that they need to check some other things. So Chair is just on me there.
Thank you, Honorable Seku.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So also on consequence management, I was just wondering if there are any other actions that could be taken, possibly that related to court. And I'm a bit out of my depth in this area, so I will listen closely. But I was wondering if maybe court orders could be used or criminal charges could be laid against accounting officers who do not respond to any material findings. And then on material irregularities in the Western Cape, I've noted that there was an increase, and I wanted to understand this a bit better. Had auditing processes maybe changed? I saw that there was 7 in 2021, 2020, 2021, and I also wanted to understand where these largely occurred. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Murray. Honorable Dagmo.
Thank you very much, Chair. Chair, the question was not whether it was necessary or not to report. It was a simple question. Did the Auditor General report? So we know that there are processes. So when the question was, it's a simple factual question, whether the Auditor General reported a material irregularity to an outside body. Since that was not whether it was necessary or not. It was just an answer. Whether and if yes, how many, if no, that's fine. So that's what we just wanted to clarify. So I think it's overly defensive to not want to just respond to the question. Because once we establish that fact, then we can say, and I think the previous member who spoke, and that's what I want to go on to next. But I just want to register my concern at the public statement of the Auditor General's office, which I also thought was overly defensive. There is a concern by the public that the Auditor General has got more powers. It takes time, and we don't actually see consequences. Obviously, the Auditor General isn't a prosecuting authority, but it is the fact that it relates to Cadillac, for instance, where the municipal managers have changed, that there's been no referral by the Auditor General to an outside body regarding Cadillac. I mean, just astounds me, quite honestly. So I'm really not sure what audits are actually being done there, with all due respect. Now, in regard to the slide of 2020 to 21, I just want to ask Mr. General if they could clarify. It says 7 ODTs, and as far as I understand, there were 4 material irregularities, and we heard that the city, I think, was 3 of those. So what I would like to ask very specifically, and try and make myself clear here, would the Auditor General provide this committee with information about exactly what those 4 material irregularities related to, a written report about what has been done in terms of, say, referring it to the municipal manager, where that case is at the moment, and what the Auditor General say there's 7 auditees. I understand the Auditor General audits every municipality. So in 2021, what does the 7 mean there? I understand that there were 4 MIs identified, but was that 4 MIs from all the 30 odd municipalities, or if the Auditor General could just explain that issue of the 7 auditees? What does that actually mean? Thanks.
Thank you, Honorable Dagmo. Ms. Adams, I don't know if you heard what Honorable Dagmo sort of stated, asked, responded to. I'm just going to just add to it. Okay, maybe I should just let you respond to the question, and I'll post my questions after. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Chair. So maybe if I can go to, okay, remember Masik was not here, so maybe I'll skip her one and come back now when she comes back now. So the next question relating to the consequence management partner, as you've raised, and I think important question, that, yeah, it's a huge challenge that we still find in the public sector, that in all the cases we don't find consequence management. So in terms of normally when we would refer for further investigation to the Hawks or so, they would then go and proceed with any criminal procedures. We've not necessarily relating to the material irregularities, but we've seen a couple of them within the Western Cape, where I think Oudtshoorn was one of them in another municipality, where actually they were charged for non-compliance with the MFMA. Those municipal managers at that point in time. The only challenge with the legal process, it does take much longer in terms of the process to unfold. But that is definitely something that in terms of pursuing. And I think important for us in terms of this amended power, because we do believe ultimately there's a lot of steps in the process in terms of making sure that the accounting officer keeps the officials accountable. And ultimately, we would believe that the fact that a certificate of debt can be issued in your name as an accounting officer should be a deterrent, because ultimately, if, for example, there was a loss of 5 million and I'm the accounting officer, but I didn't make sure it was recovered, I didn't keep the officials account, a certificate of debt can be issued in my name. So definitely, I think something for us maybe to think about in terms of when it just comes to consequence management, why is the resistance there? And maybe something deeper we need to think about. So thanks for that. In terms of the phase-in approach, so when we were looking at the phase-in approach, so we started, for example, in the Western Cape, where only one auditee was phased-in, which was City of Cape Town. And in the next year, then we phased in a couple of more auditees for implementation. So they've written the names down. So Beaufort West, Cederberg, City of Cape Town, Drakensberg, Garden Route District, George, and Stellenbosch. That the main reason for that was we were looking at the quantum of irregular expenditure in terms of the assessment, and then based on that. But important to note that, for example, as the Honourable Dagmo is rightfully saying that our teams are on the ground, we audit the same thing. So if, for example, we're at a specific municipality that's not phased in, but now we've identified a material irregularity, we can basically scope that municipality in. So not necessarily that we now discovered we ignore it, but we scope that municipality in, and we have done it in the past where we scope auditees in that hasn't been scoped in, and then we report the material irregularity as such. So maybe to touch on Honourable Dagmo's question, because he was then raising the concern. But the main reason for that, the phase-in approach and taking into account the quantum of irregular expenditure, and so that we get to that stage, I think by 23-24, all the auditees will then be phased in across the country. I think taking into account, we were more looking at a phase-in approach, taking into account COVID-19 and us having to complete 3 cycles in one, just the last part. So we are starting to get to the normality. So meaning that we're starting to look at scoping like more auditees in, and basically by 23-24, 100% implementation. And hopefully then responding to Honourable Dagmo's question. Chair, the other question that was asked by Honourable Duckmore is for us just to share the information on the material irregularities that we've reported there. What we will do, so in the City of Cape Town's case, that information is in the audit report. I think in Beaufort West case, they were just alerted me now. It's not necessary in the audit report, but it has been issued. So what we will do from our side, can we do a written response to the committee where we can provide the details to the committee what the material irregularities is about? And the context thereof. So we will make sure that we then, within the next week, we at least get that to the committee, as such, to respond to Honourable Duckmore's question. Then maybe in terms of this media article that's there, because I think most probably, I think when looking at this, it was more maybe based on our response to the journalist, because when we were responding to the journalist based on the question that he posed to us, it was more about we didn't identify any material irregularity. So we were responding to that question. But I think when you look at the caption, he most probably also misinterpreted the way he's indicating the captions to say the AG hasn't referred anything, dismissed. But we were only when we responded to the journalist, we were basically referring to that we have identified material irregularities in this regard, and that we did not identify material irregularities. But maybe if Member Duckmore, maybe if he needs further, then we can maybe engage with him further with our office and with our media liaison to rectify that misunderstanding. The other one, Chair, maybe to Member Maseko's question, because I thought let me not respond to that if you are not in the room. And in terms of the process, how it would normally work, so first step, we've identified this material irregularity, and now we're indicating to and communicate this to the accounting office that we've identified. So there's certain things that happens. It could either be they would indicate we will investigate this matter ourselves, and they would, in a lot of cases, what we've seen, refer to the internal audit unit to do the investigation. That would be an option. Or based on their database, they would look at based on the nature of the investigation, to look at the independent firm to do the investigation under the ambit of the accounting officer. So that's one option. What we also then see that in some instances, the accounting, when we actually raise this MI, they refer to a public body themselves for further investigation. That can also unfold. So what we do find that when that normally happens, when they refer themselves, the time period normally for responses, we know it takes quite a bit of time in terms of the investigation being complete and concluded on. So normally when we would look at wanting to take it further and giving the recommendation, that would be taken into account. So if it's an internal investigation done by internal audit and maybe an independent firm that they've appointed, it would follow then a specific process in terms of our follow-up process. But if, for example, refer, then we would normally get regular updates via either our coordinators from a national perspective, from the WARCS or the SIU in some of those instances, but it does take time. But normally when we would go over to the recommendation phase, it's where they internally investigate the matter themselves, either the internal audit unit or they appoint an independent firm. And we find that process is taking long. One of the key challenges that we do find across the board, that where a lot of these delays comes in terms of the process. So so now, for example, I've basically communicated material irregularity to accounting officer, but that accounting officer is only there for a period of time. So now when a new accounting officer comes, I have to reissue the material irregularity, and for him or her to then take appropriate action. So we do find sometimes in terms of, from a timing perspective, in terms of how the process unfolds, it takes longer than anticipated, sometimes because of those changes, and specifically where municipalities are also put under administration. That period sometimes do take longer. But you're 100% right in terms of we do look when the accounting officers themselves have referred something, or they're doing the investigation themselves, how we actually deal with the process as such, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Adams. Just want to ask our members if they wish to pose follow-up questions and or questions for clarity. I'll give them opportunity.
Jay, thank you very much. No, I don't need to ask any further questions, and I'd also like to thank the Auditor General for the response. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, I accept the explanation about the press briefing and thank her for being willing to provide the detail of the MIs, the 4 MIs. You're just Chair, that I think the session has helped a lot to clarify how the AG's office is going about using the additional powers that have been given. So thanks, Chair. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Dagmar. Honourable. Okay. Just want to ask the following questions in terms of the impact of unfunded budgets and how it sort of could possibly result into irregular expenditure and the ballooning thereof. That's one question. And secondly, municipalities who are not paying the ESCOM bills and the potential for them not complying with that sort of imperative may or could have the potential of causing substantial harm to the people within that municipality, and how does that feed into the audit outcome of that particular municipality? And then thirdly, I am particularly interested in municipalities receive unsolicited bids, and are they very often they're not compliant with the MF municipal management MFMA, right? And is there any need for training, additional training that needs to be rolled out to, particularly with renewable energies? And we had a similar one in Kannaland not so long ago, that it could be a potential trap for municipalities if they don't know how to deal with it. Could possibly compromise the audit outcome in the future. And then, lastly, I think something that I think that we need to consider is it's good and well to place the accounting officer at the center of material irregularities and the response to it. Very often, accounting officers are put under pressure by the elected public representatives, councillors and mayors and political parties within that environment. And they are in some instances instructed to act in and behave in a particular way. And if they don't, they get unfairly suspended, and they even get sort of unfairly dismissed at times. To what extent, or is there deficiency in our legislation where councillors who acted inappropriately can be held vicariously liable for any material irregularities that may occur within that municipality? Because if we don't bring councillors also into this, they're already in an accountability ecosystem, but if they don't not be held accountable and responsible for some of these malfeasance that may occur in certain municipalities, then they simply, accounting officers are sometimes going to be unfairly targeted and treated. So those are the questions I'd like to ask Ms. Adams. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. So if I can maybe go to the first one, which is relating to the unfunded mandate and that ultimately could result in terms of the unfunded mandate, more unauthorized expenditure for municipalities. So because they wouldn't have sufficient cash resources to be able to run their businesses, then could result in the unauthorized expenditure. I think important to note for the Western Cape itself, we have reported in the audit report where we were concerned in terms of looking at specific factors, either they don't have sufficient funding to run their operations. And so we've raised some concerns, and there's a couple of municipalities, specifically some of them in the Central Karoo district, that there is concerning of that, and then one or two in the Garden Route district. So I think this is definitely something I think that needs to give attention, taking into account the economic circumstances that we are living in. And I think in terms of this, sometimes you do find, and the provincial treasury and local government has looked at the revenue enhancement strategy within the province to see, are you actually collecting all the revenue that you're supposed to? And yeah, we're not talking about people that cannot afford it, but businesses that's in the area. And I think based on that work that they've done over the number of years, we've seen some good fruits coming to fruition where municipalities actually, it was in a dire position, but because they actually were billing the people that's supposed to be billed appropriately, actually improve their own cash flow situation as such. So definitely, I think in terms of that thinking to say, based on these challenges at the municipality, what is the different levers that can be pulled in this regard? The second one, in terms of the challenges some face in terms of paying the Eskom bill. So we have in the previous year with some, especially where there's interest and penalties charged by Eskom, because what we are saying that if you're paying this enormous interest and penalties, that could have gone for service delivery, but mainly because you're not servicing your debt appropriately and you don't have the appropriate control environment in place in order to service your debt at the end of the day. So I've made a note here, Chair, what you've indicated about substantial harm. What is the possibilities for us to explore that? Because ultimately, the municipalities, then they're getting the services from Eskom, but they're not then paying Eskom. That ultimately, if they don't do that, it will impact the services that the citizens will get in on the ground as such. So I've made a note of that. So definitely some concerns there. Then the one on the unsolicited bid one, this is a very tricky one. For any unsolicited bid to go through, there is specific criteria that you have to comply with. And where we do find a lot of times municipalities fall short if they have followed this specific process. Because remember, when it comes to this unsolicited bid process, you're saying, this is the only person that can provide this unique service to me. There's nobody else. And that is where they fall short, ultimately, because you find that there's more service providers that can actually do exactly the same thing. And I think that is the challenge, that is because the legislation is very clear on what are the conditions you can follow when you follow unsolicited bid process in this regard. But where we find, when we basically now sit back and we have to evaluate where they fall short, where they say this is a single source provider, only this provider can provide the service, where in most of the cases it's not the case, no? So that's maybe, and yes, maybe more education and more understanding then needs to be created then in this regard. The one, and I think you raise a very interesting one on the accounting officers and the role also that from a political part the councillors plays as such. And I think a lot of times you hear these noises in the corridor, but I think important to note when we go back to the Systems Act, it's very clear in terms of the code and conduct of councillors. I think it's also very clear that no councillor can be in any way involved in any procurement processes. I think it's very clearly stipulated in the legislation. And I do believe if I'm an accounting officer and I find myself in that position where I'm being told what, and I've got the administrative response, then there's processes that I can follow in terms of if any council is involved in procurement process, that's not allowed. That needs to be reported to the speaker because ultimately the speaker oversees the councillors of the municipalities. And then the non-compliance in the code of conduct results in disciplinary action. It's very clear in terms of what are those sanctions that should be then instituted or implicated. So I hope I've responded. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. They simply just don't have the gumption to report councillors, basically. That's what it boils down to. Colleagues, do you have any further questions? Ms. Mary? Okay, I'm going to attempt to have it last say. Now, in terms of during the auditing process of the PPE contracts, it was often stated that real-time auditing is taking place, which was the case at the time. And auditing and audit reports is often sort of reporting on historical events that has taken place. Oftentimes, if losses were incurred, I mean, it's very difficult to pull back those losses. What are the possibilities? And I know it is not in legislation that we bring out interim reports, half-yearly reports, so that we could arrest if there's a particular trend evolving and developing within a municipality, that we could arrest those sort of concerns much earlier than as opposed to when we get it a year later. I don't know. I don't think legislation makes provision for that, but I mean it's certainly something that would possibly be of value to us. Ms. Adams?
To add to that, maybe not adding, but just an info. I just want to find out the timing, just to piggyback on throwing in some of the things that we identify in different municipalities as we do the oversight or whatever that might be the case of the department. What period are those when you are doing auditing? It's from which month to which month, so that we can always know that now the time is ripe for us to also give the direction of what we picked up. Thanks, you, Chair.
Okay.
Yes. No, thank you, Chair. And I think important you raise in terms of the interim reporting and what can be done about it. So as you've indicated, we started with the real-time audit process for COVID. So there was about 3 reports in total. We issued 2 for the from a national government, provincial government perspective, and 1 for the municipalities, where we've actually identified findings. We are currently actually busy with the real-time audit in KZN, which report should be coming out at the end of the month. So you're 100% right. When we audit, we look at historical information. We come after the effect. No? But one of the things I think important to note, and hence I was alluding earlier about the credibility of the information and the transparency of that information. And it would be important then for municipalities to say, what are those things that we need to bring to the table to report back to our citizens, ultimately, in terms of being transparent and accountable? And I mean, to name of an example that from the province side of with COVID-19, they actually brought out their own report where they literally just showed this was all the spending on COVID-19 per department and which suppliers and the amounts. And that for me is basically showing you are transparent. There's information there out there to your citizens that they can immediately look at and ask specific questions and engage on that information. So I do believe, Chair, that is the type of thing that we need much more in terms of what specific things that's important to the citizens out there. How do we make sure we bring them in the loop and we keep them posted on things? Because a lot of times what we do find where in terms of citizens feeling they're not getting what they're supposed to, and it's because of a communication gap, being either verbally or in writing, because we're not hearing anything, we don't know what's happening. And the more we're able to engage with citizens and demonstrating, so a simple example, for example, and I think this was when we were attending one of the CSO meetings. So one of the things that one of the community members, for example, then I thought about it again, I thought, okay, maybe we must rethink how we also report. The community member said, what I would like to know if I'm staying in a specific area, there was 5 million spent, and that 5 million was spent to fix my road, to put in when the lamps went out, to put in the electricity lamps. It was spent maybe on cleaning the toilets in the area. What? But then I'm clear as a citizen in my area that I'm staying, X amount in for that. For this, the money went at the end of the day, because sometimes it's this billions rands of budget that we talking about, but we don't bring it to what was then delivered to the citizens on the ground. So the answer for me to that is to say, how can as a government be much more accountable and transparent in reporting back to our citizens? And that in itself, where the citizens can now basically ask questions about that information that is presented as such. And maybe to the second one, to respond to in terms of the timing, as honourable member asked. So normally the year end for municipalities is end of June. We normally get the financials 31st of August, which is soon. So our teams from the beginning of August would be on the ground. So it would be ideal time now to share anything with us, so that as we unfold with the audit process now, so we normally conclude by the end of November.
Thank you so much, Ms. Adams. I think before Ms. Hardin, you have any comments you'd like to make, or before we close?
Thank you, Chair. I think your question regarding the unfunded budgets and whether or not it can lead to irregular expenditure. Provincial Treasury does an assessment on all budgets, whether it is credible and sustainable. And I respectfully ask that you direct that question to the Provincial Treasury that can give you a formal write-up in terms of what we do with the budgets. In terms of the Eskom late payments, the Western Cape government has a committee that deals with all payments that are late to Eskom, as well as to the Auditor General. It's a program that we run in the Western Cape. And again, respectfully ask you to write to Mr. Stephen Kenyon that can explain to you the Eskom and the AGSA late payments, which we have a process to follow up on. In terms of your underfunded, there's a difference between unfunded and underfunded budgets. And again, the Provincial Treasury can take you through that process, because if one takes, for example, the library function, it is a provincial competency, but the infrastructure lies with municipalities. The question is always, how much do you plow into such a service? And I think, again, the Provincial Treasury can take you through that process. You will also find, barring for the city, I think the future for material irregularities, especially in coalition councils, is probably going to bring us more work, because when you have a coalition council, it makes it very difficult for the administration to actually do their work, because there's a whole lot of fighting between councillors. And I think that's a space to watch, especially, and if we can ask the Auditor General specifically to look at where there are coalition governments. It is proving to be difficult on the administration side. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Hardin. Much appreciated. We'll pursue those avenues of exploration. Thank you. Right, connect set. Seems that you, Honourable Dugmore, is there anything else you'd like to ask perhaps before we close?
Thank you for asking, Chair. No, thank you very much for the information and presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ms. Adams and Ms. Kellen and your team, Thank you for giving us a in-depth sort of perspective of a complex concept at times to implement. I mean, it's easy to, theoretically, deal with the concept, but the implementation thereof is often very difficult in the environment that we operate in, particularly municipalities. And it's just one thing that you mentioned, and I think that we don't fully understand. Well, in fact, we do. We'd like to overreach and overstep our our, our powers. In a sense, the oversight responsibility as this committee has over municipalities, we do have legal opinions that do not provide us with an opinion that we do have direct oversight of the municipalities, and calling municipalities, I would like to do that, so that we as a committee could engage with them, um, but it's something that we need to explore, and try to just push the limits in terms of our um, oversight role. And I think the Standing Committee on Human Settlements have an innovative way in which they do that with municipalities. Um, but I'll have to speak to my chairperson as to how we could use this committee in a way in which we can sort of enforce accountability within this ecosystem that you're talking about. So we are privileged, Ms. Adams, to have you here. You have not engaged with us for a while, and it's good to have this person engaged with Ms. Cullen. Also to get to know the people that we work with, you work with, and then we work with, and um, it's been now quite a number of meetings that we've had. So we have thoroughly dealt with the audit outcomes and the audit reports, etc. We'll see each other again with the annual reports, and that's not long from here now. I mean, it's just within the next 2 months that we will have sort of vigorous and engagement with each other. But thanks a lot for your availability and your transparency and your openness, Kevin, and the team to share information with us that we think it is will make us govern better and keep those who are within the accountability ecosystem accountable. Thank you, and carry on with the good work that you're doing. We are eternally grateful for the sacrifices you do make. Thank you. Do you anything that you'd like to say, Ms. Cullen? Okay. The Honorable Maseko?
Sure, I think when they move out, you might have an irregular expenditure on the tables outside.
Yeah, so before you depart, you have to assist us to avoid irregular expenditure if you don't indulge. The committee will stay behind for a minute or two just to pass resolutions, if any. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
That didn't go well. That's what the Honorable Maseko was referring to about the food outside. Thank you. Okay, there are two, just whatever you capture so far, Jan, the resolutions. One is in terms of the report on material irregularities. I think the 7 auditees as well as
That-
the 4 the report around that.
And the invoice and then the details around
details.
that. Yeah.
Mm.
Got that.
So, Honourable Dagmar, that one of the resolutions. Any other resolutions?
Chair, thanks. No, I did send.
Okay.
Excuse me, I did send
Okay.
to the committee coordinator just with the possible formulation of that.
Okay.
It's quite straightforward as he has indicated. Thanks.
Thank you. Then any other resolutions, colleagues? Honourable Seku?
I think maybe another one that we have to put in, it will be the one of engagement with the provincial treasury for the unfunded mandates and the underfunded mandates, so that we have an understanding of that, maybe
Okay.
to put it in future in our program.
So, Chair, could we possibly put at the meeting on the 6th?
We can adjust the agenda. Yeah, do that.
Yeah, because we don't have many slots available till the end of the year, so we need to do it soon. And maybe because we planning a meeting for the 6th of September because of the provincial week that has been now postponed by another week. So we're thinking on the agenda is to have the 3rd quarterly report and the Section 106 investigations. And then we can add this to that as well. So
I think we can add that, and I think it will be a blessing in disguise before the annual reports, because of the deviations that happens because of the unfunded mandates. Also, sometimes of the underfunded mandates, that there is a playing around with the coffers within municipalities under the titles of. That's my perception, that the deviation sometimes it gives empowerment to some of the things that were underfunded or unfunded. So if we have an engagement, to have an understanding of that, it will help us as we do the annual reports to ask the right questions.
So let's just how are we going to formulate this, Jan? What do you have there?
No, I was just going to ask you now. So we don't really put it in as a resolution, but I've got it now as an agenda item for the 6th. So then we only have the one. See, another note that I've made was is with regard to the impacts and inviting them to SCOPA meetings. I think that's maybe a very good starting point to get that little bit of oversight over municipalities, or provide municipalities with the ability to do proper oversight when they see how SCOPA interrogates the departments.
Yeah, more especially because of the auditor on the ecosystem, the AG indicated that also we have responsibility of where we can call the municipality to come to account. So for us for municipality to come in account, it's better. It's I didn't want to touch it, that it's a debate on another level, but it's better if we create a relationship with the MPEC to make our life easier in looking at the processes that we do when coming to doing an oversight, that we can give them the tools of trade. It's working for us. It's not 100%, but I think 80% we are championing it, so we can give them, share that 80% and see if it can add value.
Thanks, Honourable Mr. No, I agree. Any other? In the absence of any further resolutions and engagement, colleagues, I want to thank you for your presence and the thoughtful and stimulating questions you've posed. Long live the spirit of interrogation. Thank you. Okay, have a lovely day further. Goodbye.
Thank you, Chair.
Very stupid question to answer. What is impact?
The IPAC is a municipal public accounts committee, it's like SCOPA.
So is that where like the councillors would go to account on what they're doing through their wards?
No.
So
That
it's
way,
the public account, the scope, you understand the scope? I'm getting. Yeah. So the public accounts committee,